ex-prisoners of Reddit, who was the most evil person there and what did they do that was so bad? I was in prison for 27 months. Unfortunately, your child rapists and kiddie porn guys were mixed into general population, so you would get all kinds like that everywhere. The worst one I heard of was when I was in military prison. Details are foggy because this was 13 years ago, but I remember there being a guy who got 99 years for murder. He had killed a guy, then killed the guy's wife because she was home and would have been a witness, but not before raping her first. The whole facility got locked down every time they moved this guy because they didn't even want the other inmates to see what he looked like. The other messed up one was at the same facility. In the army there's a thing called turtle fucking, where you hit someone's Kevlar helmet with your Kevlar helmet. It makes a loud thong sound, but doesn't really hurt. People didn't hit super hard, just hard enough to make the noise happen. This guy turtle fucked a girl when she wasn't wearing a Kevlar helmet. She ended up dying while the guy was still awaiting his trial, and he went full-on cuckoo bananas. There was a guy I was locked up with in Baldwin County, Alabama who went into our block's common area library, just a bookshelf with about 50-60 books, and ripped out the last chapter of every single ducking book. I was locked up with Jodi Arias, so that was bizarre. There was also a woman who murdered her baby and kept it in the freezer. We called her Maytag. I was in a women's prison. New inmate told everyone she was in for tax fraud. Couple of days later, she gets the crap beaten out of her and doesn't leave her cell again. Food gets taken in by screws, and eventually she gets ghosted out. Turns out she was in her side of prison and both her husband and son were in the male side of prison for running a child porn ring. Those guys had been put straight in the VP wing, but most female prisons don't have enough sex offenders to have one. It was one of the screws who told some of the inmates why she was in. They wanted her to be taught a lesson. The offenses were awful. She was fully part of it and was responsible for acquiring a lot of the victims as she was trusted by people. Her youngest victim was her niece's 3-month-old who had to be hospitalized due to trauma. I worked as a parole officer for a while. Some sex offenders are beyond help. Some are truly evil. Example, one guy kept his 9-year-old daughter in his basement, no other family, and raped her repeatedly while torturing her, including force-feeding her until she threw up and then forced the throw-up down her throat. After caught and did his prison time, he got less than 80 years for this. He would bitch often about how the system was out to get him and it wasn't fair. He is a puss who should have got life. I had a cellmate in prison who was a KKK white boy. He was a madman. He was always pissed off and would say the craziest stuff like, "Did you hear that? The white rhino is going extinct. Fucking Jews." I was watching the movie about black pilots in World War II and he sat down indignant and rolled his eyes and guffawed. "Black pilots? Come on," I said. "You really think there are no black pilots?" He said, "Hell no. Have you ever seen a black pilot?" It was like this every day until my move finally got approved. English guy here. I spent 4.5 months in prison in 2018. There was a guy who was really nice, seemed like a genuine guy. That was until I found out he strangled his drunk wife to death and left her there whilst he went to work the next morning. I was a correctional officer and we had an inmate like that. We didn't do a full lockdown, but every inmate had to be in their housing unit anytime we moved him. Couldn't have any other prisoners with any shot at getting to him. He was accused of beating a 3-year-old to death. None of the guards were thrilled, but it was our job to protect him and we did. Then when he was at the courthouse for a hearing, their dumbass security failed. Some other prisoners got to him and almost killed him before they were stopped. They could have killed him easily if they hadn't dragged it out to make him suffer. At his trial he was found not guilty. I, 20-year-old male, was in an juvie from 15-18 until I went to county jail. The worst people I came into contact with was a 15-year-old boy who shot his stepmother, slit her throat, beat her head in with a blunt object, wrapped her in sheets for the father's roommate to find, then he shot him. Happened in McMinnville, Oregon. Other than that, a lot of people raping siblings and making threats to shoot up the high schools in the area. That's Yamhill County for you. This rich kid stabbed his friend in the chest, killing him, but he was on Xanax and weed at the time and doesn't remember anything of it other than his friend on the floor dying. The mad thing is this guy, 18 years old, actually got off with the murder and was found not guilty. although was sent down for just under 2 years for possession of a knife. His parents were quite wealthy and it was a big case in the UK. Basically his barristers were the best money could buy and he said that's how he got off. Edit. He didn't have any remorse for his actions, which made him a pretty fucked up person. It's a funny one though because he actually seemed like a nice guy, until he would talk about the killing and just didn't care what he had done. Nobody else in the prison had ever killed anyone to my knowledge, as it was a lower cat prison, but he was only there for possession of a knife. When I was in the outbox the day before I was released, I was hanging out with a bunch of guys just killing time. One of them was part of a mutie killing gang. They kidnapped and killed a bunch of people for body parts, and cut them off while the people were alive. It was a pretty gruesome case. Anyways, he was really quiet and rather stupid, just a simple farm boy type. When I was in jail, my cellmate was a guy who tied his old lady down to their table and tried to carve "do not resuscitate" into her chest. Halfway through, the cops showed up because the neighbors could hear her screaming. I tried as politely as I could to tell the captain that I don't mess around with woman beaters and asked for a block transfer. Thankfully they put me in work release, which was awesome because I got to work in the kitchen and deliver food to the different blocks. Well, one day I'm serving food to one of the solitary cells and as soon as the slot is opened, a drenching wet magazine gets thrown out. Turns out the magazine is covered in piss and the woman inside the cell is the chick my previous cellmate carved up. Turns out she stabbed her son with a syringe of her blood and she was inside too. Some crazy stories all around, but that couple by far were the craziest people I saw. Not sure about most evil, but interesting story. When I did time, I was bunked up with a guy who had stabbed his uncle to death who molested him. Guy was insanely mean, but when lockup came, he was super nice to me. He was 23 but couldn't read or write, so he would dictate letters to his girlfriend and I would write them for him. I was a detention officer for a while, and I never looked too much into what the kids did, especially if they were well behaved. There was this one kid that was just great, always helpful, and never caused problems. One night in the control room I mentioned to a coworker how awesome this kid was helping close up the kitchen, and she says, "Have you seen what he's in for?" I had not, so she showed me that he was actually in for molesting his 18-month-old baby sister. There was a corrections officer at least 6'5" and well built, and he would always come and piss off. So one morning we are waiting in line for breakfast and he thought he heard this older man call him a bitch. He followed the man back to his cell and started teeing off on him. The man didn't even try fighting back, and when he fell the first time he split his head open on the steel bunk. The inmate was so out of it he started asking where his car keys and wallet went while he was on the ground bleeding. The corrections officer hears the man and for some reason turns around and goes back and hits him a few more times and says, "Who's the bitch now?" This was my experience in jail. Most of the people there were in because of a bad day. That's not to say all of them, but one of my best friends I met in jail helped him get a job when we got out, and to my understanding he's lived a pretty decent life ever since. On a different note, the first night I was in there was a black guy who was sleeping across the bench when I got put in the cell. There was one other white guy sitting in the corner of the bench crammed to the wall. The black guy poked his head up and looked at me, then looked at the white guy and told him to get up so I could sit down, while the black guy was still laying down. The white guy refused and got one of the worst beatings I've ever seen. I only mention their races because I'm Native American and I firmly believe he just wanted to beat up a white guy. At the end of it all, I got the entire bench to myself for the night before being moved to general population. I would dare to say the corrections officers were the worst. They too seemed to always be looking for a fight or a reason to stack up charges. The utter amount of disrespect from them was kind of baffling. Hands down. So this lady was married, husband cheated, he had a full-blown affair, ended up with a love child. Somewhere along the line the wife is babysitting the husband's illegitimate child. He comes home from work, sits down to eat dinner and asks her, "How is the baby?" She says, "I don't know." You tell me. This lady ended up killing the baby, cooked it, put it in the food and fed it to him. She's doing 2 life sentences. This is in Arizona, by the way. She looks like the devil. Her eyes are literally black and she looks like she has no soul. It takes a lot to creep me out, but this lady's vibe is one of the darkest things I've ever felt in my entire life. There was this dude in his 40s who was a janitor at an elementary school. He was weird, with a giant Star of David tattoo on his back and blonde highlights in his longish bowl-cut black hair. He sodomized 2 girls, 9 and 11, with a broom handle. I think his charge was sodomy with a foreign object. I remember everyone feeling contempt because we knew that in that county, sex offenders got off easy. Fortunately, we were wrong. He was given life. I remember the paper he got from court read, release date, deceased. There was another chamo who raped his 3-year-old daughter, and when his wife caught him, she freaked out and called the police. He ran from the cops in a car and drove off a cliffside. Whether that was on purpose or not, I'm not sure. Here is where it gets worse. So after the accident, he couldn't talk or act normal. He was essentially retarded, would shuffle around and rock back and forth anytime someone talked to him. Brain damage is what people said. From the car crash, people were nice to him until they found out his charge, then ignored him or were cold towards him, but he was restarted at this point, so no one went out of their way to harm him. This went on for maybe 7 or 8 months, but people started to say he was full of shit because gradually he started acting more normal, or people would catch him acting more normal than they believe he tried to portray himself. Eventually, it became obvious. He could not keep up the charade any longer and everyone knew he was faking being retarded. People started messing with him and tormenting him, people pissing on his laundry bag, trustees banging their brooms on the side of his cell wall to make him start going crazy and crying. He was still trying to act like he was restarted but was slipping up and slacking at times, and it became obvious he was full of it. The worst part is that he only got 4 years. 4 years for raping his daughter. I got 6 years for robbing someone of their drugs. Anyway, when he got to state prison after being shipped from the county jail, he got beaten real bad. Word travels in the system. I think he spent the remainder of his time in isolation. Even the guards hated him and knew he was bullshitting.